The first thing you read when you go on the Wikipedia page of the telepathy tapes is it's pseudoscience and it's been critiqued. When you first were asked to join the team and when you were seeing all these results, what was your initial thought?
My role initially was really doing the brain mapping and seeing, can we see what's going on in these kids' brains when they're engaged in these telepathy exercises? And then when I saw it for the first time, I mean, honest to God, I think my jaw probably hit the ground.
Jeffrey Tarrant is the lead neuroscientist behind the breakout podcast series The Telepathy Tapes and founder of Psychic Mind Science. His work bridges science and the mystical, exploring psychic abilities, altered states, and the edge of human consciousness.
I can share a little bit of a recent experience I had on Zoom with a non-speaker. Never met him before. They read me and spelled independently on their keyboard things that there's no way they could have known. And it was like, holy crap.
I've got two examples from the tapes that I'd like to just go a bit deeper into because I found them just so transformative, if this is true, that it's a shift that I don't think we're ready for.
I don't know if I can share a lot, but
the future looks amazing, but also a little scary. If you, just like me, want to have an honest outlook of what the next chapter could look like and how best to prepare for that, I ask for one simple favor: subscribe, so I can invite the brightest minds on this podcast and get those answers for both you and I. Enjoy the episode. Can we all become psychic?
You know, of course, I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I'll tell you what I think and kind of where I've come to from this point. And I would say the answer is yes, but I would clarify it a little bit. And my current way of thinking about this is that we're all psychic, that it's a natural ability, and that the issue is that we've sort of developed our left hemisphere logical, language-oriented brains to the point that we've essentially inhibited these natural abilities. And so I think the issue is not, do we have these, but it's like, how do we reconnect with that? That they're there, but we've kind of forgotten. We've forgotten that they exist. We've forgotten how to use them. And so then, there's certain individuals who haven't forgotten, who are able to tap into this, and certain individuals who are, really gifted. But I think we all have the ability and the potential.
When do you think we lost this ability? When you look back at how technology has seeped into our everyday life, was there a moment that you think, 500 years ago, that we started losing this intuition, this psychic ability?
I don't really know, but I think it does make sense, kind of what you're implying, right? That it's like, as we became more technologically advanced and we started using that language left hemisphere brain more and more and more, relying less on our connection to nature. I really think that's where things probably shifted, is once we sort of became disconnected from nature. Because for how many thousands of years, that was a critical element of how we existed. We had to be in tune with the natural cycles. And, now we don't have to at all. If it's hot outside, I go inside and I turn on the air conditioning. I don't have to deal with, at least some of us, right? Unless you're in London. But, so we don't have to be aware of that. We don't have to pay attention to when the sun comes up and the sun goes down and what the weather's like. Like we buy our groceries at the grocery store. So I feel like we've lost our sort of natural connection to a large degree, and technology has probably influenced that. But another way to think about that same question is, I think, looking at our development as we age, as we get older. Because one of the things that we see really clearly is that young children talk about seeing spirits, seeing ghosts, talking to invisible energies. They know things. They're highly intuitive. They're more connected to nature. And then once they sort of hit a certain age, very often those things disappear. They go away. And it seems to be, there's a couple of issues, I think. One is, as they become more sort of indoctrinated into how society works, right? That it's like, here's what's appropriate. Here's how you think. We put you in school. It's a very left-brained, logical, analytic, language-oriented process. You start learning that it's not okay to talk about certain things, that those aren't real, that those are pretend. So, there's that element, but there's also an interesting process that happens with brainwave development. So younger kids, their dominant brainwave is actually theta. It's a slower brainwave, and it's a more receptive brainwave. It's a brainwave associated with things like hypnosis. It's an easy way to connect to your subconscious and to connect to sort of other states of awareness, right? So that's the natural.
Is that natural just for children to be in that state?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not because they're using less technology or anything. It's their natural state.
It's their natural state. And, what's interesting about that is, it's probably there for a good reason, because their brains are more receptive, which means it's easier to pick up and learn from your environment, right? You're a kid, you don't know the rules, you don't know what you're supposed to do, but your brain is like a sponge and you just absorb everything in the environment. And so theta allows that to happen, but it also allows us to be connected in these interesting ways. And actually, another interesting part of that is, probably most of your listeners, and I'm sure you have, heard of the Schumann resonance, which is sort of an electromagnetic frequency between the ionosphere and the earth. And so, we're bathed in electromagnetic frequencies. Some are natural, some are not, right? But there are natural electromagnetic frequencies that we live in, and they're important for our health and our well-being. And what's interesting is the dominant frequency that we live in nature it's called the Schumann resonance, and it's 7.83 hertz. It's very specific, which is theta. Theta is 4 to 8 hertz. So like the natural energy that we live in is theta, and that's the dominant brainwave for children. And then as they get older and their brains develop, their brain speeds up. And then they move out of that sort of theta state into more of an alpha state. And we think of alpha as being, like this nice, relaxed, receptive state. But actually, part of what alpha is doing is inhibiting information. It's limiting information. It's creating a structure in the mind in terms of what works, what's reality, how you see yourself, how you see the rest of the world. And so we move into this more limited sort of view of how the world works. And it's a natural development, but it coincides with the exact time frame when kids kind of lose their ability, when they stop paying attention to these things. So I think there's a couple of interesting ways to think about, how do we lose this, right? Like there's probably a longer historical trajectory of moving away from nature, but then there's just this sort of natural developmental thing that happens with the brain, whether you're in technology or not. It's just sort of, how it works.
I was reading a bit about your story and I resonate with it strongly. And I think a lot of our listeners will definitely resonate with it. The idea that when you were younger, you were spiritual and more connected. And then you went through a system and you became, whatever you want to call it, indoctrinated, or you changed your mind, or you became more systematized. And I was very similar. I became, a atheist / agnostic and would listen to whatever lecture at university. And then all of a sudden you start to reconnect in your 20s and 30s and start to realize there's probably more than we know.
Yes.
In particular, 12 years ago, you were still a bit of a cynic, a skeptic in the kind of median psychic space. And you started studying their brainwaves and their brains. What did you find out?
Yeah. So, I would say I had already started opening back up to some of these things, before that happened, but I wasn't really investigating psychics or mediums. I wasn't really in that space. I was more interested in spirituality and my own, and wasn't really connecting those things together. To me, they were sort of separate things. And, I was more interested in meditation and Buddhism and Taoism and Qigong and these kinds of things. And then, yeah, I had this opportunity to look at the brainwaves of this woman. Her name's Janet Mayer. And so at the time I was working at the University of Missouri, and her son was a student there, was a student of mine, and, said, hey, my mom's got this interesting thing. Do you want to measure her brain? And I was like, sure, why not? Right? Like, sounds interesting. And, Janet's story is very interesting because she kind of has always had some psychic mediumship ability. She's one of these that can talk about when she was a little kid, seeing ghosts and knowing things before they happened and all this kind of stuff. And it never went away. So she's one of those that it never just disappeared. But what's remarkable about her, I mean, that's remarkable by itself, right? But the other piece is she went through this holotropic breathwork experience just for the heck of it. In fact, her sister kind of convinced her to do it. So she went to this, it's a rapid breathwork process that kind of leads to like a psychedelic type experience. And in the middle of the experience, Janet just started speaking what sounded like a language that she'd never heard before. She didn't know what she was saying. She didn't even know if it was a language. It just started coming out of her. And, you can imagine that would freak you out a little bit. And it freaked her out. But then that didn't go away either. So she left the session and this kept happening. And over time, she sort of got control over it so that she could turn it on and turn it off. Whereas prior to that, it would just happen spontaneously. She'd be at the grocery store and all of a sudden she's speaking this thing, right? Anyway, this was the part that they were interested in. They said, hey, my mom's got this weird thing. Do you want to map her brain? Like, sure. And yes, I was pretty skeptical, right? Because I was like, this sounds bonkers, right? That it's like all of a sudden you just start speaking this other language. And it had been apparently verified that she was speaking 4 different dialects of South American tribal languages.
Wow.
Yeah. She studied like a semester of Spanish in high school or something and had never been out of the United States, right?
Were her parents from the continent, from South America?
Nope.
No connection.
Nope. No. So that's what makes it more convincing, right? It's like, so somebody verified this, and said, yeah, this is what's, it took her 4 years to find somebody that could help her figure out what was going on. And so, but even then, right, I'm kind of going like, this sounds kind of far-fetched, right? Like, come on, I'm open to some things, but this is pretty wild. But then after I met her, that was pretty convincing too, because she's very humble. She's, she was as curious as I was, right? She was kind of like, I just want to know what the heck's going on. Like, this is super weird. Like, what is this? And she was even okay. Like, if you come back and say, this isn't a language, this is gibberish, I'm okay with that. I just want to know what's going on. And, and she wasn't like woo woo. She wasn't way out there. She was very grounded and, seemingly pretty normal. And so I was like, okay, all right. And then, when we looked at her brainwave activity, because again, now she's got the ability to turn it on or turn it off at will, which made it great for testing. So we could get a baseline EEG with her just having a regular conversation, and then get an EEG with her speaking these languages. And when we looked at that and compared them, the first thing that really jumped out at me was this activity kind of in the right parietal lobe, kind of back here, that when you just look at the raw EEG, it almost looks like a seizure. Like the EEG was just going off the chart. And, when I first saw it, again, my skeptical brain, I was like, I don't think this is real. I think there's something wrong with my equipment. Maybe I got a bad connection back there. There's some other logical explanation. But, I tested her 4 or 5 or 6 times, different conditions, different caps, tested everything, triple checked everything. And this pattern kept showing up. And so then when I started looking like, well, what is that part of the brain? Like, what does it have to do with? And why does it keep showing up over there? And turns out it's an area of the brain that has been looked at in relation to transcendent spiritual experiences. And so it kind of got dubbed the God spot, this region. And, of course, researchers don't like that, right? Like it's like, don't call it the God spot, there's more than one area of the brain involved in spirituality. But nonetheless, this region got this name. And really, it's because what they found was that people that had injuries to this part of their brain became more empathic and reported having more spiritual experiences after the injury. And so it's kind of like getting that part of the brain out of the way facilitated some of these interesting experiences for these people with head injuries. And what that part of the brain does is it actually creates boundaries. So when it's working normally, it's basically like creating an ego boundary and saying, I'm Jeff, I live in this body. You're Julian, you live in that body. We're isolated, we're separate. But if you all of a sudden disrupt the activity there, it seems to open up the possibility of extending the way that you perceive things outside of yourself. You can extend it beyond. And so I think that's probably what was happening, with Janet, is that for some, however it happened, she was able to essentially knock that part of her brain offline temporarily, which is, I think, what then allowed those languages to come through, right? Because it's more permeable. There's not a rigid boundary anymore. And what's interesting is when I started looking at other mediums, they showed similar things going on in similar parts of the brain. And so it's like, okay, maybe there's more to this, right? Maybe it's not just Janet. Maybe this is a bigger pattern.
From a biological standpoint, what is having that blocker actually doing for us? As in, if we were all walking without this blocker, what would happen?
Yeah, well, good question. Who knows, right? But what I would guess, just based on what I've kind of seen, is that we would all be aware of each other's energy and thoughts and, and not even just each other, but whatever kind of spiritual energies, whatever you want to call it, right? If there's whatever's floating around out there that has some sort of consciousness. And so, of course, that's going to be very distracting to trying to live a human life, right? So I think a lot of times what the brain has done is created these boundaries as a way for us to stay focused on our survival. What do we need to know and be aware of right now in this environment to ensure our survival? And, being aware of everybody else's energy is probably just a distraction on some level, right? That it's like, you don't need to know all of that. You need to focus on what's relevant in your environment right at this exact moment. So Aldous Huxley, right, who wrote The Doors of Perception and various other, classic books, he talked about the brain as the brain in general as essentially being a massive filtering mechanism, that it takes all this information and then boils it down to just what we need, right? That it's like, and everything else gets eliminated. And so I think he was right. They didn't have the science back then to sort of demonstrate his observation, but I think he was spot on in terms of that understanding.
So we've talked a bit about holotropic breathwork, being able to, and I'm assuming that happens to very few people that go through those cycles. I've tried a lesser version of it. And then plant medicine, I'm sure, provides access to that. And then you also have NeuroMeditation, which is your form, which I'm assuming is your form of getting there without the extremities of going through a plant medicine ceremony. Is that correct?
I think that there are a variety of tools or techniques that can help the brain become more flexible. And so that's kind of the way I started thinking about things, is that when we talk about these filters and these limitations that the brain puts on us, essentially what we're saying is that the brain has become kind of rigid, right? It's created this structure and said, nope, this is it. This is all that there is right here, right? And so it's a little rigid. And so for me, one of the things I think that is a useful approach is like, well, how do you create more flexibility in the brain? Because you also don't always, like we were just suggesting, you don't always want to be on the other side. In fact, I've started working with people that's their issue. It's too much. And they're trying to figure out, like, how can I get my filters back in place?
How does that manifest for them?
Yeah, I mean, in different ways. But, so for some of them, one of them, it's a friend of mine, and his daughter has been having these issues ever since she was little, where when she goes to sleep at night, she'll, it's frightening to her because she'll be aware of these other energies and these other beings and this other stuff. And they've tried everything, and they've talked to every doctor around, and nobody can figure out what's going on. And so, he started figuring out, like, okay, forget that. Forget all the Western medicine. I'm going to treat this like it's some sort of spiritual, psychic kind of thing. And how can we create more boundaries? And when they started doing that, things got better, right? And so for her, it was frightening, right? Because it was like there's all this stuff happening to her that she didn't know what to do with it. I've got another person I'm talking to right now who's, an adult, and, she had what she describes as a Kundalini awakening, right? So this sort of energetic awakening that kind of like cracked her wide open. And so now she feels like ever since that happened, it's really difficult for her to feel like she's in her body. She feels like she's like this floating consciousness out there, and, being grounded and being present is really difficult. And so, of course, that's disruptive, right? Like that's a problem. If you need to like have a job and like do things. And so again, we're trying to figure out, like, well, how can we create more stability and more boundaries? So you don't want to always be on that side, but what you want is the capacity to move back and forth, right? That flexibility. So things like plant medicines, holotropic breath work, other kinds of breath work, these can all do that, right? They can kind of create an opportunity for the brain to be more flexible. If we want to talk about it in terms of like creating more entropy in the brain. And then, the other techniques that I've been working with, go ahead, you were going to say something.
What do you mean by entropy?
Right. So entropy, the term entropy originally came from the study of thermodynamics, right? But it's been applied to other things. And the idea is that entropy is sort of like disorder, chaos, right? So things usually start off like humans, right? We start off with very low entropy. And then as we get older, things start falling apart, right? So there's increased entropy, right? In sort of a system. Most systems move toward entropy over time. They sort of get less organized, more chaotic, start falling apart. And so there was a researcher actually in the psychedelic space who's written a couple of articles on thinking about entropy in terms of consciousness, and has said, well, we move through states of consciousness, some that are more disordered, like a little more chaotic. So dreaming, right? Or infant consciousness, or psychedelic states, psychosis, right? So there's these different kinds of states of consciousness that we can be in where things are kind of messy. They're disorganized. There's not a clear structure. And then we can get on the other side where there's very low entropy, sort of a rigid state. And that's, where we get into things like different mental health concerns, right? Because if you think about, like, just pick something like anxiety, the way that I think about something like that is that the brain has gotten stuck in a pattern that's not helpful anymore, right? It's not helpful, but you can't stop it. It's just this like rigid, repetitive state, right? And so kind of what we want to do is be able to move back and forth. So we're not on one side or the other. And so what I've been trying to do is then look at, because I work a lot with technologies. And so, how can we use technology for our benefit? So rather than causing us problems, which it certainly can do that, but how do we use it to sort of help the nervous system increase this flexibility, or in certain cases, decrease the flexibility, right? So that things can be more stable And so we're using, neurofeedback, audio-visual entrainment. Those are really the two primary tools. We use other tools as well, but those are the two biggies.
And what does the journey of someone look like that enters the clinic? Because you're a clinical psychologist and a neuroscientist. So do they usually come as individuals with anxiety, with depression, looking for something that just isn't available? Or is it more spiritually inclined individuals who are looking to reach a greater elevation of spirituality?
Yeah, both really. I'm moving more and more out of my clinical work just because this other stuff is kind of taking a lot more attention and is very interesting to me. So I've been putting more energy into the more spiritual, psychic development, kinds of aspects of all of this. And so the short answer is it depends, right? It depends on the person and what they're coming in for. But typically, at this point, I'm really working more with groups kind of on Zoom as opposed to them coming into the office, because we've got technology now that's very user-friendly, pretty cost-effective, that, people can use at home. And so then my job just becomes kind of coaching them, essentially, like, how can you use this tech to kind of help open things up, right? Or shift your brain into specific states that are interesting or important for you. And it could be mental health oriented, right? Like maybe you want to improve your sleep or you want to have a better mood, whatever, or more focused attention. Okay, well, we can do that. But then again, we can also use it to target these other brain regions. So like the God spot, like we can target the God spot and say, well, what happens if we kind of coach that part of the brain to be a little more open? Does that facilitate anything?
Is there a way that someone could access their God spot? Or what I'm thinking of is how one can go from being in a more relaxed state for bed and then waking up, having their coffee in the morning and being like, you know what, I need a bit of a pick me up. Like, how can I get into this kind of energized state for the work day? Is there something that our listeners could do right now to access that?
I mean, probably not right this second, but I shouldn't say that, right? Because again, I think there's a lot of variability for each person, right? For some people, it's easier to shift that God spot. Others, it's really sticky, right? It's it's going to take a little more work. But honestly, anytime you experience something simple, like we'll just keep it really simple. Like when you experience empathy, right? So somebody else is experiencing something or some other part of the world or whatever, and you feel that yourself, right? And you're connecting to their experience. Well, even something as simple as that, and there's a lot of meditations that do that, right? There's lots of different compassion, loving kindness type meditations that do that. You're extending your consciousness outside of yourself and connecting to something outside of yourself, which is exactly what we're talking about. So, anybody who's practicing any of those kind of meditations, you're doing that. And so I think the trick then becomes, can you do it outside of meditation, right? Because what a lot of people do with meditation is they do their 15 minutes or their half an hour, and then they get up from their cushion or their chair and they go about their day and they kind of forget about their meditation, right? And so for me, the issue becomes, it's like, well, it's not just on the cushion. Like you're doing this to bring it into your life in some sort of real way. So then how do you do that, right? So you go to the coffee shop and you're waiting in line to get your coffee. You can practice then, right? Can you notice somebody else and try to connect to how they might be feeling and experience that? So even simple things like that, you're challenging the rigid ways that spot kind of normally behaves. And you're kind of learning how to have more flexibility and how to connect to other people. And, that'd be step one, right? And then if people have more of a spiritual practice, well, then how do you do that with other spiritual energies, whatever that is? If people, are into having spiritual guides or helpers or talking to their ancestors or, angels or whatever, right? But it's the same idea. It's the same concept. But that just may feel more far out for certain people, right? But it's the same concept. Can you expand your ability to get outside of your own head? And that's tricky. And again, back to our original conversation, the way that social media works and things, we're paying more and more and more attention to ourselves. And sort of this becomes the only reality. And so again, we have to kind of challenge that a little bit because, the brain is easily programmed. And so we can get sort of stuck, with not seeing other perspectives or getting outside of ourselves.
It's a good segue into the telepathy tapes, which for our listeners that haven't had the chance to listen to the podcast is about non-verbal autistic children who can read the minds of their caregivers. Sometimes their caregivers can read their minds. And in some cases, the autistic children can read the minds of anyone, which for the skeptics amongst our listeners is pretty profound. And the first thing you read when you go on the Wikipedia page of the telepathy tapes is it's pseudoscience and it's been critiqued.
Yeah.
So I'll ask you, Jeff, when you first were asked to join the team and when you were seeing all these results, what was your initial thought?
It's funny because when I agreed to my role initially was really doing the brain mapping and seeing, can we see what's going on in these kids' brains when they're engaged in these telepathy exercises? I really didn't know what to expect. I was just kind of like, sure, yeah, this sounds cool. Why not? And then when I saw it for the first time, I mean, honest to God, I think my jaw probably hit the ground because, I totally get that when you hear about it or even when you watch some of the videos, it's very easy to be skeptical or to pick it apart or to say, oh, well, this might have been going on or that might have happened, or maybe there was some cueing from somebody, or I totally get it. But when you see it yourself and you see it repeatedly over and over and over and over, different conditions, different kids, different families, you can't deny it, right? I mean, it's like, and so we're at a tricky point, which is that, people like myself and others who have had the privilege to witness this for the last 2.5 years. I mean, it's been going on for a long time, right? But I've been witness to it for the last 2.5 years. I need zero convincing at this point, like none, right? And I totally understand why a lot of people are going to be like, this sounds crazy, right? Like there's got to be another explanation. I get it. And so that's what we're working on. We're working on like, how can we scientifically demonstrate this? Not for me. I don't need it. I'm good. But how can we scientifically demonstrate this so that people who have concerns about what's actually happening, that we can say, look, we've addressed all those things. And in fact, I don't know if I can share a lot, but I can share a little bit of a recent experience I had on Zoom with a non-speaker. Never met him before. This was the first time we met him. And they read me and spelled independently on their keyboard things that there's no way they could have known. And now that was the first time that's happened to me. And it was like, holy crap. Like I've seen some amazing things, but this was beyond, right? And so anyway, it's funny, right? Because you see this enough times, you start to get used to it. And it's kind of like, yeah, okay, all right. Oh, another kid doing telepathy. Okay, all right. It's weird how quickly you adapt.
Just walk us through like exactly that moment. As in, when I think about that, like on the Zoom call, is it you're thinking something specific? Or is it just your train of thought? Because the brain is so complex and I sometimes feel like I've got 5 thoughts happening at the same time.
Yeah. So yeah, there's 2 really important things there that I want to at least mention. But so in this case, we were practicing a new protocol that we want to use for the testing. And so what happened was another researcher on the team sent me a little video clip that I'd never seen before that she had just made for this test. So nobody had seen it except for her. So she emailed it to me. And so I'm watching a little short video clip, and it's got an image on it. It's got a word on it. And my camera was off. My microphone was off. I wasn't sharing my screen. So this non-speaker described the image exactly, spelled the word that was on the screen perfectly, and then, we were all kind of in shock because we weren't really expecting that level of accuracy and specificity. And so we were commenting on that, and it was like, wow, like that was amazing. Like, nice job. We're telling the kid, right? Like, okay. And the speech language therapist that was sitting there with him said, do you know where Jeff's at right now? And he types Oregon. I'd never met him. We hadn't even talked about this. Like, he knew where I was. Again, I'm not sure I'm supposed to be talking about a whole lot of this because it's all still in process, but so I'll leave it there. But this just kept going on and on. Like, his ability to have information about everybody that was on the call, there's no way he could have had otherwise. And especially the video. Nobody saw the video except for the other researcher. One of the things that I've become aware of, and this is the other point that I wanted to make from working with some of these kids, is that I feel like they all have this ability to different degrees. But the thing that seems to make the big difference is that some of them have more difficulty managing their bodies. And some of them have more difficulty managing their attention. And so if they can't manage their bodies, it's going to be really difficult to spell and to be, calm and to be able to sit still and engage the way that we would like, right? And then the other part is, and again, I'm just learning this, but they apparently are in telepathic communication with all kinds of people all the time. And so they've got all this information coming in. And so to be able to sort through that and go like, no, I'm only going to pay attention to what Jeff's looking at right now. Not everybody is super skilled at that, right? Like that takes some skill all by itself. In fact, the speech language therapist, I've heard her a number of times working with some of the students and say, tell your friends to go away because we need to focus on the lesson, right? and she's talking about his friends up here, right? That he's having some conversation in psychic space that is distracting him, right? From like doing the lesson. So I think it's really complicated. And we're just scratching the surface of like how this works and how these kids operate. They're amazing and they've taught us a lot. And so, I feel really privileged that I've had the opportunity, to learn from them. I feel like it's expanding my awareness and my understanding, every day.
I've got my half brother is nonverbal and autistic, and he's 6 years old. And it gives me I think it gives everyone such a different perspective and compassion for these individuals. And what was repeated quite a lot by Kai is that often, which is true, these autistic children see what they have as a gift and actually as a unfair advantage in this world. And there's something very beautiful about that, like a different perspective. But in terms of the science, what is going on? Let's just say it's the caregiver. And one of the questions one of our listeners wanted to understand was why some of the children, the non-speakers, only communicated with their caregivers and weren't able to do it with others. Like, what is happening there? What are they seeing? Is it colors? Is it patterns?
Yeah. So again, this is something that we're still again, there's a couple of like elements to this, right? And one of them is still something we're learning. It kind of makes sense that some of them have different sensory preferences, which makes sense. Like neurotypical people have different sensory preferences. You talk to somebody, it's like, oh no, I learn by seeing something. Oh, I have to hear something. Oh, I need to do something. And they seem to be the same way, right? That it's like some of them get a lot of visual information. Some of them hear information more clearly, which makes perfect sense, right? It's kind of like, when you say it, it's like, oh, well, that seems obvious, right? But they will talk about, and I've observed this, that many of them seem to be looking through the eyes of the other person. So they're kind of using their neurology. And so like I've seen this a lot actually, where the non-speakers will be spelling and they're not even looking at the board. They're like looking over here and they're spelling stuff out. And it's like, but the person sitting with them is looking at the board, right? So they're basically using their eyes to do the task. Or one of the students that I worked with, she would do this game with her mom where she would match colored popsicle sticks to different, there was like 6 different colors. And she would take a popsicle stick and put it in the right pile, right? If it was a yellow stick, it went in the yellow pile. If it was purple, it went in the purple pile. But she was doing this blindfolded, right? So give her a popsicle stick, she'd stick it on the right pile, right? Like every time. And it was like, how's she doing that, right? So we don't really know like how this exactly works. And there does seem to be some individual variability, in terms of what sensory processes they're using or how they're gaining that information. The other part related to only being able to do it with their caregivers is interesting. And again, I think we're still trying to learn this because there's certain people, like the person I just described, I'd never met him before. And we're not even in the same state. And he, read me clear as day, right? But that's an exception, right? Like we don't see that all the time. But it does seem to be the case that most of them do best with their primary caregiver. And that could be for lots of reasons, right? It could be the emotional connection. But I think actually part of what it is that's where they've had the most practice. That's the person that they've connected with the most. And one of the things that we see with a lot of the non-speakers is that every time you ask them to do something different, it's almost like starting over, even if it's small, right? So for example, it's another criticism that people have. It's like, well, if they're spelling on this laminate letterboard, why can't they spell on the computer, right? And from a neurotypical perspective, it seems like it's the same thing. It's the same thing. But for them, it's not. Like if you change it, it's learning a whole new skill. Now they got to learn how to use the computer keyboard. And so it makes me wonder if it's the same thing with connecting with their parent or their caregiver. They're really good at that. They know how to do that. And then you say, okay, now connect to this other person. And it's like, oh, well, I've never done that before, right? It's like, that's a new skill, right? It's like, oh, okay. And again, like in our neurotypical brain, it's kind of like, well, what's the big deal? Like if you can connect to that person, why can't you connect to that person? And it's like, it's different, right?
Are they born with something, or is it simply that it's our need to want to communicate and that is their mode and they're not distracted by other modes of communication?
Yeah. I mean, many of them, if you ask them, like, how long have you been able to do this? And it's like, oh, forever, right? Like, it's just a natural thing for them. I suspect that part of the issue is the language issue, right? Because why do we see this in the non-speakers so clearly, right? When you look at people who are more verbal, they can still demonstrate telepathy, but it's nowhere near the level of accuracy and consistency that we see with the non-speakers. And so, again, my sort of thinking at this point is that verbal language is actually getting in the way, right? It's sort of noise in the system. So if you think about how much of our thoughts are words, we're basically talking to ourselves in our heads all the time. Right? We're using words. It's like blah, 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 blah. It's a constant noise machine up there, which is going to make it really difficult to hear anything else. It's like you're just hearing your own thoughts. Well, if you don't have all of that, well, gosh, there's a lot more space all of a sudden, right? That it's like if you don't think in terms of verbal language, well, then, what does that leave? I mean, the other way I like to think about this is just like we were talking about the brain limits information, so do words, right? It's like, and again, it's one of those like meditation, Zen koan kinds of things, right? Or whatever, right? The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon, right? Those kinds of things that it's like, well, having a label for something is not the thing itself, right? And so as soon as we put a word on something, we've changed its nature. We've limited it. We've said, here's what this is. It's this little thing. And so, the way that I think about this a lot is in terms of different world religions, where many of them will say very directly, you can't talk about God. Because as soon as you talk about God, you've limited God. And God is limitless. So you can't talk about God. Right? So they say this in Judaism, Taoism, the very first chapter of the Tao Te Ching, right? Paraphrasing, but the word to describe Tao is not the Tao.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can't do it. So I think not being limited by verbal language actually makes them much more open and receptive.
Fascinating. I've got 2 examples from the tapes that I'd like to just go a bit deeper into because I found them genuinely like just so transformative, if this is true, that it's a shift that I don't think we're ready for. One of them is when Asher, one of the non-speakers, simply puts his hand on a book and gains all the information in that book. Jeff, like, what? Like, this is like, okay, I can get telepathy, but this sort of level, it just seems like, what is going on from a neurological standpoint there?
Yeah, no idea. So he's one of the students that I've not worked with yet. Hopefully I'll have an opportunity. So I've not witnessed that. I mean, I've of course heard it, in the tapes, but I've not witnessed that myself. So I can't speak to it too much. But in some ways, I mean, it doesn't shock me actually if that's true. And I think the reason it doesn't shock me is because the way that I'm starting to see things is that, and this isn't new information, right, for people that study consciousness, but the idea that, information exists in a field out there, whatever kind of an energetic field, like all information. And so some traditions will call it the Akashic records, right? But it's all the information in the field. And so if you can open up, and then if you've got some level of focus or, way that you can direct that, you can access anything. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, maybe they've figured out how to, if somebody hands them a book and it's like, okay, I can download this, right? It's like the Matrix, right? Like you plug in, and it's like, oh, here's the program for Kung Fu, right? Like, boom, okay, got it. But this is more, intellectual knowledge. So to me, it seems certainly possible, right? Or even like going back to the beginning of our conversation with Janet Mayer, how could she possibly be speaking 4 different, South American tribal languages that, just out of nowhere? Like, where did that information come from? Like, I don't know. It had to come from out there somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. And somehow she's tapped into it. So to me, they're all kind of related.
Yeah.
It's just what aspect are you able to sort of tap into, with any sort of consistency?
It feels that we're operating in a 2D, 3D world, and that is just 5D thinking, just a level of elevation. And I'm just imagining it, this like web of information and consciousness that we're just like, but we're so busy looking at our phones and just in the modern world that we're preventing ourselves from elevating into what these kids have been able to do, which is, it's fascinating. I think it's giving us an idea. I hope the consequence of the telepathy tapes is we start actually putting down our phones and start getting back to self and what's possible. This is really exciting.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think it's, I know Kai uses this term a lot, talking about sort of paradigm shifting. And, I really do think it has that potential, and of course there's going to be some people that no matter what we do, no matter how good the research is, no matter what, it's not going to matter. They're not going to be able to accept the reality of this. But I think there's a lot more people that, when they see these things and when they see the research as it comes out, there's multiple groups working on really solid research right now. So there's going to be some really excellent papers that come out in the next year. And it's going to be harder and harder to deny it. And, and again, I think that's going to wake us all up, right? Because what are the implications, right? Like if this is real, which again, I've already told you, I'm convinced it's real, right? But if this is real, what does that mean, right? Like it's like we have evidence that we've never had before that consciousness is not stuck in your head. That's a big deal.
It's, yeah. It is a paradigm shift of a magnitude that is so profound. And before we got on the call, I was jokingly saying that, 200 years ago or 400 years ago with Galileo, most of the world, or everyone thought the world was flat. And now, thankfully, the vast majority of us believe that the world is round. Well, actually, I say the world is round, but maybe we'll have a paradigm shift with that. But this is the sort of paradigm shift that will be talked about for centuries and could make us understand consciousness, the afterlife, spirituality, everything. If I were to give you a crystal ball right now and you were to look at what happens in the next 5 years, like what are we going to find out? And how will AI play a part in this as well?
So if I had a crystal ball and I knew how to use it, I've actually got a crystal ball over here. I just don't know how to use it. But the next 5 years, I feel like it's already happening, that people are waking up, if that's the term we want to use. We hear that term used a lot, but I think that's what it is, right? In terms of seeing that there's a lot more and accepting that, and then starting to get curious about, well, what does this mean for me, right? So I feel like I've been seeing more and more people that are interested in exploring their own consciousness and figuring out, like, how can I get out of my own way? And so that's interesting, right? Like putting down your phones, but learning how to meditate and, having more awareness of your internal states and how to navigate that with some level of proficiency. So I feel like those things are going to happen more and more. Now it's interesting, because at least in the United States, there's such a dramatic split in the population in terms of, what's going on here culturally and politically and otherwise. So I cannot predict how that's going to influence things. I have been really encouraged by what I've seen in terms of people being very open to understanding this and exploring it and wanting more. Like, I feel like people are hungry. Like all of a sudden it's like people are like, yes, 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 yes. How can I get more? How can I get more? And I think that's a good start, right? Because they're asking questions and they're thinking, beyond the rigid, small ways that we're used to thinking, starting to open our eyes. And then as people start to have their own experiences, right? Then it's like, oh, that changes things, right? As people start, noticing different things. So what I'm hoping, this isn't the crystal ball, but what I hope is that we will start becoming more empathic, and we'll start, understanding that we're all connected and we're not little individuals floating around. And if we're all connected, then how do we treat each other? And how do we take care of each other, right? And as far as, the non-speakers, for them, I feel like this is going to be really important, because I think part of what we're going to be able to do as well is demonstrate that they are communicating their own thoughts, that this isn't coming from, the facilitator or whoever, the speech communication partner that's working with them, that it's their thoughts. And to get it more generally accepted that this is a valid way of communicating for them to spell on a letterboard. Because I feel like a lot of these kids have really been neglected in terms of their education and their opportunities, because we've assumed that there's nothing going on and that they don't understand anything. And I think what we're learning is that they understand a lot and they can communicate a lot, but we have to give them the opportunity. We have to give them the tools to do that. And we have to, again, the term that gets used a lot, presume competence. We have to presume that they're intelligent and that they have something to share. And so for them, I'm very hopeful that this is going to change the opportunities for them, education, occupation, their lifestyle, and really improve their quality of living. So I don't know if that's crystal ball or that's my hope, maybe a little bit of both. I guess we'll see.
Sadly, John Paul, one of the this is a spoiler for anyone who hasn't listened yet, passes away. 17 years old, has a seizure in a hot tub outside. And what is so profound then afterwards is that he is able to communicate with other non-speakers in the afterlife, and they're able to communicate with him and see him as this. He's 6'8" in real life, and then becomes this 10-foot giant and is incredibly well respected in the afterlife. This is so profound, and so many people around the world are looking for answers when it comes to the afterlife, when it comes to death. The paradigm shift here is just, it's bigger than anything. It's bigger than superintelligence or biological immortality. This is the answers in this box are just, could just change everything.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've done a lot of work looking at, the brain imaging with neurotypical mediums, right? So they're connecting to your loved ones on the other side and communicating things like that. And so it's interesting because we do hear that a lot of the non-speakers, I'm not going to say all of them, but a lot, also talk about, it's just like a normal thing. Oh yeah, I communicate with our ancestors and, and with our friends and, family members and whatever that have passed. Like it's just a normal thing for them. And so, this is something we're just getting ready to explore, because the more we work with them, it's like it just keeps opening layers, right? It's like the telepathy was a lot, right? It's like, oh my God, okay, this is a thing. And it's like, oh no, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on too. And it's like, oh, okay, like, all right, we haven't even wrapped our brain around how to look at this. I'm actually getting ready to go travel and do some brain imaging with a non-speaker that's their thing, right? Is kind of talking to spirits. And so, maybe I'll have some interesting information after that. I don't know. We'll see. But what I wonder if is going to happen is once we start investigating that aspect of their abilities, that we learn something the same way we have with telepathy, right? So I was kind of saying before, like, yeah, we're all telepathic, but man, they're like next level, right? Like So maybe it's the same thing with spirit communication, right? Like, yeah, there's some really good mediums out there who are very evidential. They can bring forth specific information. Maybe these guys are next level with that as well, right? And it's like, again, we could learn a lot, I think, from what they report and how they describe things and how this works. That, maybe we aren't going to learn from neurotypicals.
There's something about a medium that I think a lot of people are very skeptical about because of the nature of one earning potentially lots of money through being a psychic. But I feel with the non-speakers, they have no monetary reason to be having these thoughts. It just this is the paradigm shift. I think this is what is going to be the accelerator. There isn't any snake oil, smell of snake oil around this.
Yeah, it's a good point. Because that's it's an easy thing to kind of look at with, especially the mediums that are, pretty skilled. They're out there, charging a lot of money to do readings and, and events and things like that. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I mean, hey, if they're helping people, great, good for them. That's awesome. Yeah. And I've met many of them who I've been pretty impressed with what they've been able to come up with. Right. So it's kind of like, all right, like, I don't know where you got that information, but, including reading me, right? Like things that they've told me that I'm like, okay, there's no way you could have known that. And very specific, right? But yeah, it does change the way you think about it when all of a sudden it's somebody who their motivation is not, is not making money or making a name for themselves or getting famous or whatever, right? It's like, this is just what they do. It's just a normal thing for them. And so, yeah, I do think that will, at least for some people, right, who are skeptical of mediums, that may make a difference. I mean, the trick is going to be, so what we do with neurotypical mediums is we put them through rigorous testing to say, well, can you bring forth information that's specific and detailed, right? So that, so somebody just says like, oh, I'm picking up a grandfather. And it's like, well, okay, great. That's not very specific. But when they come up with a name and they come up with like, here's how they died, and and they've got these specific things, it's like, okay, all of a sudden that's much more convincing. So the trick is going to be like, well, how do we do that with the non-speakers? Like, how can we, because it's much more difficult to work with them just because of their apraxia, their difficulties with controlling their body, right? It's just, it's a much slower and, challenging process. So I think it can be done. It's just going to take us a minute, I think.
What advice would you give to someone who is looking to access some of these amazing qualities that some of the non-speakers have been able to tap into? Not just psychic abilities, but also just being more intuitive of their body, of themselves, and maybe reaching a higher level of consciousness.
And again, just real practical things. And I think you've already mentioned it, right? Like, putting the phone away. So spending more time in quiet or in nature, right? Because again, like if the whole idea is that the brain is overloaded with other information to the point that you can't hear the subtle information. I mean, that's an easy way to think about it, signal and noise, right? So if there's a very faint signal, there's a sound way out there, and I've got my radio on and I'm thinking a bunch of thoughts and I'm distracted by something else. There's no way I'm going to hear that sound that's a street away, right? But if I eliminate all the other distractions and I quiet my mind and I turn off the radio and I put my phone away and I listen, I might be able to hear it, right? And so I think that's actually a pretty decent analogy to what we need to do, right? So get rid of the distractions, learn to quiet yourself down. Because again, your thoughts are distracting. So if your mind is filled with distracting thoughts, you're not going to be able to hear or see any other information. So, the thing, every psychic medium I've ever talked to, they say, meditate, learn how to meditate. And I think that's why, right? Because it's like you need to sort of quiet that internal state so that there's not a bunch of noise, so you can actually pick up the signal.
Jeff, this has been one of the most fascinating conversations I've ever had.
Oh,
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And yeah, can't wait to have you back on.
Yeah, sounds good. It's my pleasure.
If you want to know what tomorrow has in store like I do, you definitely want to listen to our recent episode where I talked to Peter Diamandis about a future where we could live forever. Thank you so much.